The phone rang at 5:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in March, cutting through the silence of my small apartment like a blade through fabric. I knew before I answered. You always know when death comes calling. There's something different about the ring, something urgent and final that makes your stomach drop before your mind can catch up. Danielle? My cousin Marcus's voice was thick with tears I'd never heard him shed before. It's Grandma Evelyn. She passed in her sleep last night. I pressed my back against the cold kitchen wall, sliding down until I was sitting on the linoleum floor. The phone trembled in my hand as Marcus continued talking about arrangements and services, but his words became white noise. All I could think about was last Thursday, the last time I'd visited her little house on Oak Street with its peeling blue paint and the porch swing that creaked in the Alabama wind. She was asking for you, Marcus said, his voice breaking through my fog. Right up until the end, she kept saying your name. Of course she did. Grandma Evelyn had always been my anchor in the stormy sea that was the Carter family, while everyone else saw me as the difficult one, the black sheep with too many opinions and not enough sense to keep them to herself. She saw something different. She saw me. After I hung up, I sat there on my kitchen floor for nearly an hour, watching the morning light creep across the walls of my cramped apartment. This place, with its secondhand furniture and walls thin enough to hear my neighbors' arguments, suddenly felt like a sanctuary compared to what I knew was coming. The funeral, the family, the careful choreography of grief performed by people who'd spent years perfecting the art of exclusion. I called in sick to work at the community center where I counseled teenage mothers, knowing my supervisor would understand. Mrs. Jenkins had lost her own grandmother the year before, and knew the weight of such loss. She didn't ask questions, just told me to take all the time I needed. But time was exactly what I didn't have. In our family, grief operated on a schedule, and I was rarely consulted about the timing. The arrangements were already being made by the time I called my sister Latoya that afternoon. She answered on the fifth ring, her voice crisp and businesslike, as if discussing the death of our grandmother was just another item on her executive assistant's to-do list. Oh, Danielle. Good, I was going to call you. She didn't sound like she was going to call me. The funeral is Saturday at Riverside Baptist. Reverend Hill is officiating. We're having the repast at the church fellowship hall afterward. What can I do to help? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Everything's handled. Mama's taking care of the flowers, and I've arranged for the programs and the catering. Uncle Jerome is coordinating the pallbearers. A pause. You just need to show up, just show up, as if I were an acquaintance, a distant relative who'd send a card and make a brief appearance rather than the granddaughter who'd spent every summer of her childhood in Grandma Evelyn's kitchen, learning to make cornbread and listening to stories about our ancestors. What about her things? I asked carefully. Has anyone gone through the house? Another pause, longer this time. We'll handle all that after the funeral. As a family. The way she said family made it clear that while I might be blood, I wasn't truly part of the decision-making circle. I'd learned long ago that in the Carter family hierarchy, love was measured by income, education, and how well you fit into the mold they'd carved out for respectability. My job at the community center, my small apartment, my tendency to speak, my mind about injustices both large and small, these things marked me as less than. But Grandma Evelyn had never seen me that way. She'd seen the girl who'd cried when we drove past homeless camps, who'd gotten suspended in high school for organizing a protest against the terrible conditions in the school cafeteria, who'd chosen social work over law school because she wanted to help people who actually needed help rather than those who could afford to pay for it. She loved you, you know, I said quietly into the phone, though I wasn't sure why I felt the need to reassure Latoya of this fact. I know she did. Latoya's voice softened slightly. She loved all of us. That's why we need to do this right, Danielle. With dignity. The way she would have wanted. After we hung up, I went to my bedroom and pulled out the black dress I'd bought. 2 years ago for my college roommate's father's funeral. It was simple, appropriate, unremarkable. Exactly the kind of dress that would help me blend into the background and avoid drawing the kind of attention that would give my family ammunition for their whispered criticisms. But as I held the dress against my body in the mirror, I remembered something Grandma Evelyn had said to me the last time I'd visited. She'd been sitting in her favorite armchair, the one with the faded floral pattern that she'd reupholstered herself decades ago, and she'd looked at me with those sharp brown eyes that missed nothing. "Don't you ever let them make you small, Danielle." "Marie Carter?" she'd said, using my full name the way she did when she had something important to say. "You were born to take up space in this world, and anybody who tells you different is lying." I hung the black dress back in my closet and went to bed early, but sleep didn't come easily. Instead, I lay there thinking about Saturday, about facing my family, about trying to grieve for the woman who'd been my champion while surrounded by people who'd never understood why she'd chosen to champion me in the first place. Outside my window, the city hummed its nighttime song, and I wondered if Grandma Evelyn was somewhere listening too, hoping I'd remember her words when I needed them most. Thursday morning brought a text from my mother that made my coffee taste bitter. "Wear something appropriate. No bright colors. This isn't about you." I stared at the message for a full minute, waiting for the follow-up text with actual funeral details or maybe even a "how are you holding up?" But nothing came. Just that terse reminder that in my family's eyes, I was always on the verge of making everything about me. I drove to Birmingham that afternoon, taking the familiar route through the suburbs where I'd grown up, past the shopping centers and chain restaurants that had sprouted like mushrooms in recent years. The city had changed, but the feeling in my chest as I crossed the county line was exactly the same as it had been in high school, a mixture of belonging and suffocation that I'd never quite learned to reconcile. My mother's house sat in the middle-class neighborhood where she'd moved after Daddy died. A brick ranch with a manicured lawn and shutters painted the exact shade of colonial blue that the homeowners association approved. I sat in my car for a few minutes before going in, watching the sprinklers water grass that was already green enough to make the neighbors jealous. "You look tired," Mama said when she opened the door, which was her way of saying hello and criticizing me at the same time. She was already dressed in funeral black, even though we had 2 days left, as if mourning required a uniform and early commitment. The house smelled like lemon furniture polish and the lavender air freshener she bought in bulk from the dollar store. Everything was exactly as it had been the last time I'd visited 6 months ago. The same family photos arranged on the mantel, the same silk flowers in the same vases, the same feeling that I was a visitor in a museum dedicated to a life I'd never quite figured out how to be part of. Latoya was in the kitchen, naturally, holding court at the breakfast bar with our aunts Beverly and Denise. They all looked up when I walked in, and I could feel the silent assessment happening. My jeans instead of dress pants, my natural hair instead of the pressed styles they favored, my general failure to meet whatever standard they'd set for appropriate grieving attire. "Danielle," Aunt Beverly said, standing up to give me the kind of hug that was more performance than affection. "I'm so sorry, baby. She was such a good woman." "The best," I said, meaning it, and something in my voice must have been too raw because the conversation paused awkwardly. Latoya cleared her throat. "We were just going over the final arrangements. Mama's arranged for a beautiful spray of roses for the casket, and the programs turned out lovely. Very elegant." She handed me a folded piece of paper. The funeral program with Grandma Evelyn's photograph on the front. It was a formal portrait from maybe 10 years ago, when her hair was still more black than silver, and her face hadn't yet taken on the gaunt quality that came with her final illness. She looked dignified, proper, exactly the way the family wanted to remember her. But it wasn't how I remembered her. I remembered her in her house slippers and one of her many floral house dresses, flour in her hair from making biscuits, laughing at something ridiculous on her afternoon talk shows. I remembered her hands, always moving, always doing something useful, mending clothes, tending her garden, braiding my hair during those long summer visits. "It's nice," I said, because that was what was expected. Reverend Hill has prepared a beautiful service, Aunt Denise added. He knew her well from all her years in the church. He'll do her justice. I nodded, though I wondered what doing her justice meant to them versus what it meant to me. Would he talk about her volunteer work at the soup kitchen? How she'd insisted on serving meals even when arthritis made it painful to stand for long periods? Would he mention how she'd quietly paid for groceries for families in the neighborhood, when money was tight, never making a show of it, never expecting thanks? Or would it be the sanitized version of Grandma Evelyn, the church lady, the devoted mother and grandmother, the woman who'd raised 5 children and never complained? All true, but not complete. Not the woman who'd taught me to question authority when authority was wrong, who'd marched in civil rights protests as a young woman, who'd told me stories about our family's history that the others preferred to forget. Where will I be sitting? I asked, though I already suspected the answer. Well, Latoya said carefully, the front rows are reserved for immediate family. The children and grandchildren, you know. But there's plenty of room in the section behind us. Behind them. Of course. In Baptist funeral tradition, proximity to the casket was a measure of importance, and I'd been measured and found wanting, before the service even began. That's fine, I said, though it wasn't fine. Nothing about this was fine. I spent that evening in my childhood bedroom, which Mama had converted into a guest room but still contained traces of the girl I'd been. A.e. few books on the shelf, a certificate from high school debate team, a photograph of me and Grandma Evelyn at my college graduation. In the photo, she's beaming with pride, her arm around my waist, wearing the navy blue dress she'd bought specifically for the occasion, because she said it was important to dress up for important days. That night, I called my friend Maya in Atlanta, the one person I could trust to listen without judgment. They're treating you like an outsider at your own grandmother's funeral? Maya's voice carried the indignation I felt but couldn't express to my family. It's not that simple, I said, though it kind of was that simple. They have their way of doing things. Their hierarchy is messed up, Maya said bluntly. You were closer to her than any of them. You visited her every month. You called her every week. You took care of her when she was sick. All true. But closeness and care weren't what mattered in the Carter family ecosystem. What mattered was appearance, respectability, and the kind of success that could be measured in dollars and degrees from the right universities. I just want to get through Saturday, I said. You will, Maya said firmly. And if they give you any trouble, you call me. I'll drive up there and show them what trouble really looks like. After we hung up, I sat on the edge of the bed holding the funeral program, staring at Grandma Evelyn's formal portrait. Tomorrow would be the viewing, and Saturday would be the service, and then it would be over. I would have done my duty, paid my respects, and I could go back to my life in Atlanta, to the job where I was valued, and the friends who saw me clearly. But something nagged at me, a feeling I couldn't quite name. It had to do with the way Grandma Evelyn had looked at me during that last visit, as if she'd been trying to tell me something important but couldn't find the words. At the time, I'd attributed it to the medication she was taking for pain, but now I wondered if there had been more to it. I fell asleep holding the program, and I dreamed of summer afternoons in Grandma Evelyn's kitchen, the sound of her humming old spirituals while she cooked, the way she'd always saved the last piece of cornbread for me because she knew it was my favorite. In the dream, she was trying to tell me something, but I couldn't quite hear her over the noise of the family talking. In the next room. Friday evening at Resurrection Funeral Home felt like stepping into a play where everyone knew their lines except me. The building itself was the kind of place that specialized in dignity. Thick carpets, soft lighting, and the hushed atmosphere. That funeral home's perfect like an art form. The viewing room was filled with flowers, their cloying sweetness mixing with the underlying scent of industrial air freshener that never quite masked what it was trying to hide. I arrived exactly when I'd said I would, 6 o'clock, but I could see I was already behind the family's invisible schedule. Latoya stood near the casket receiving condolences like she was hosting a networking event, perfectly composed in a black suit that probably cost more than I made in a month. My mother flanked her on one side, my cousin Marcus on the other, forming what looked like a receiving line for grief. The casket was beautiful, I had to admit. Polished mahogany with silver handles, surrounded by an explosion of roses, lilies, and carnations in shades of white and pale pink. Grandma Evelyn lay inside looking peaceful and formal in a way that felt wrong to me. Her hair too perfectly styled, her makeup too flawless, her dress a navy blue suit I'd never seen her wear in life. "She looks good, doesn't she?" Aunt Beverly appeared at my elbow, her voice carrying that peculiar satisfaction people get when funeral preparations meet their standards. We wanted her to look dignified. I nodded because what else could I do? Tell them that she looked like a stranger? That in life, Grandma Evelyn had been more likely to be found in her garden clothes, dirt under her fingernails from tending her tomatoes, than dressed up like she was going to Sunday service. The room was filled with people I recognized from church, from the neighborhood, from various chapters of Grandma Evelyn's long life. They moved in quiet clusters, sharing memories and offering comfort to the family. I watched from my position near the back as people approached Latoya and my mother, clasping their hands, murmuring condolences, treating them as the primary mourners. Mrs. Washington from down the street found me eventually, enveloping me in a hug that smelled like peppermint and powder. "Oh, honey, I know how much you loved her. She was so proud of you." "Thank you," I managed, though my throat felt tight. "You know," Mrs. Washington continued, lowering her voice, "she talked about you all the time, about your work with those young mothers, about how you were making a real difference. She used to say you had her heart for helping people." Before I could respond, Mrs. Washington was moving on to the next person, but her words stayed with me. Grandma Evelyn had been proud of my work. She'd understood why I'd chosen social work over law school, why I'd taken a job that paid in satisfaction, rather than status. I made my way closer to the casket, navigating through the crowd of mourners. Up close, I could see the details of the arrangement, how someone had chosen flowers that would photograph well, how the lighting was positioned to create the most flattering angles. Everything perfect, everything proper, everything designed to create the right impression. But what impression were we trying to create? That Evelyn Carter had lived a life of quiet respectability? That she'd been a good church lady who never caused trouble? That was true, as far as it went. But it wasn't the whole truth. Danielle. Reverend Hill appeared beside me, his presence both comforting and unsettling. He'd been Grandma Evelyn's pastor for over 20 years, and I'd always sensed that he saw more than he said. "I was hoping I'd see you tonight." Reverend Hill. I shook his hand, noticing how he held mine a moment longer than necessary, as if he was trying to communicate something. "Your grandmother was a remarkable woman," he said quietly. "She had strong opinions about what was right and what was wrong. Never hesitated to speak up when she felt something needed saying. Something in his tone made me look at him more closely. She was always honest with me." "Yes," he said, and his eyes held mine. "She valued honesty above almost everything else, said it was the foundation of real love, being willing to tell the truth even when it was difficult." I wanted to ask him what he meant, but before I could, Latoya materialized at my elbow. "Reverend Hill, thank you so much for everything you're doing for us tomorrow," she said, her voice carrying that particular tone that meant she was managing a situation. "We're so grateful." "Of course," he inclined his head graciously. "Evelyn was special to all of us." "She was," Latoya agreed. "Such a pillar of the community. We want to make sure tomorrow's service reflects that. Her dignity, her faith, her dedication to family." I caught the emphasis on family, and wondered if it was directed at me. Reverend Hill seemed to catch it too, because his expression became carefully neutral. "The service will honor who she truly was," he said simply. After he moved away, Latoya turned to me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I'm glad you're here, Danielle. I know this is hard for all of us." "It is," I agreed, though I suspected we were each finding it hard in different ways. I wanted to mention, tomorrow, during the family viewing before the service, it would be better if you let the immediate family have some private time first. You know, the children and their spouses, the grandchildren who were really close to her. The grandchildren who were really close to her. The words hit like a slap, delivered with such casual cruelty that I almost admired the technique. "Of course," I said, proud that my voice remained steady. "It's nothing personal," Latoya continued, her tone suggesting it was entirely personal. "It's just that some of us have been more involved in her day-to-day care, especially in these last months." This was a lie, and we both knew it. I'd been the one driving to Birmingham every few weeks to check on her, to take her to doctor's appointments when no one else was available, to sit with her during the long afternoons when her arthritis was too bad for her to do much more than doze in her chair. But apparently being there for the unglamorous parts of caregiving, the prescription pickups, the grocery runs, the simple companionship of watching afternoon television together, didn't count as being really close in the family's accounting. "I understand," I said, though I understood more than she probably intended me to. The rest of the viewing passed in a blur of forced conversations and careful navigation around the invisible boundaries my family had established. I spoke to the people who approached me, accepted condolences, and tried to ignore the way certain relatives seemed to look through me as if I were part of the furniture. As the evening wound down, I found myself alone with Grandma Evelyn for a few minutes while the family clustered near the sign-in book, thanking people for coming. I stood beside the casket, looking down at her peaceful face, and whispered the things I couldn't say with an audience. "I'm sorry they're making such a production out of this. You would have hated all the fuss." I paused, my throat tight. "I'm sorry I won't be sitting in the front row tomorrow. I know you would have wanted me there." For a moment I could almost hear her voice, the way she'd sounded that last Thursday when I'd visited. She'd been lucid that day, more alert than she'd been in weeks, and she'd held my hand while we sat on her front porch watching the evening shadows lengthen across her garden. "Don't you let them write me off as just another sweet old church lady," she'd said suddenly, her grip on my hand surprisingly strong. "I lived a life, Danielle. A real life with real opinions and real love. Make sure they remember that, at the time." I'd thought it was just the rambling of someone dealing with pain medication, and the confusion that sometimes came with her condition. But standing there beside her casket, I wondered if she'd been trying to tell me something more specific. "I'll remember," I whispered. "I promise." When I finally left the funeral home that night, the Alabama air felt thick and oppressive, heavy, with the promise of tomorrow's rain. I drove back to my mother's house through streets that seemed both familiar and strange, past landmarks from my childhood that looked smaller and shabbier than I remembered. Tomorrow would be the funeral, and then it would be over. I would sit in the back. I would listen to whatever sanitized version of Grandma Evelyn's life the family had approved, and then I would go back to Atlanta and try to hold on to my own memories of the woman who had seen me clearly when everyone else looked through filters of disappointment. But as I lay in bed that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something important, something that would change everything, if I could only figure out what it was. Saturday morning arrived with the kind of gray sky that promised rain by afternoon, the air thick with humidity that made my black dress stick to my skin before I'd even left my mother's house. I'd slept poorly, haunted by fragments of dreams I couldn't quite remember, and I woke with a headache that felt like a band of tension wrapped around my skull. Mama was already dressed and drinking coffee when I came downstairs, her movements sharp and efficient as she gathered her purse, her church fan, and the small package of tissues she always carried to funerals. She looked me up and down with the critical eye she'd perfected over years of motherhood. "That dress is appropriate," she said, which was the closest thing to approval I was likely to get. "Your hair looks nice, too." I'd spent extra time that morning taming my curls into what I hoped was a respectably conservative style, nothing too natural or political looking that might give the family ammunition for their whispered criticisms. The irony wasn't lost on me. Even in grief, I was performing respectability for people who'd never quite accepted me as I was. "Are you riding with us?" Mama asked, though her tone suggested this was more obligation than invitation. "I'll drive. Myself," I said, pouring coffee into a travel mug. "I might need to leave early." This was a lie. I had nowhere to go and nothing pressing waiting for me back in Atlanta. But I needed the option of escape, the possibility of getting in my car and driving away if the day became more than I could handle. "Suit yourself," Mama said, and I could hear the relief in her voice. One less complicated dynamic to manage in the family car. The drive to Riverside Baptist Church took me through downtown Birmingham, past the Civil Rights Museum and the Kelly Ingram Park, where protesters had been attacked with dogs and fire hoses. In 1963. Grandma Evelyn had been there, though she'd rarely talked about it. She'd been 19 then, young and fearless in the way that only teenagers can be. And she'd told me once that she'd been arrested twice during the demonstrations. "But we don't need to dwell on all that," she'd added quickly, the way she always did when the conversation turned to things that might be considered too political or controversial for family consumption. That was a long time ago. Except it wasn't a long time ago, not really. It was part of who she'd been, part of what had shaped her into the woman who'd raised me to question unfairness and speak up for what was right. But I knew that version of Grandma Evelyn wouldn't be mentioned in today's service. That would be too complicated, too potentially divisive for a family that prized harmony above honesty. Riverside Baptist sat on a corner lot in a neighborhood that had seen better days, its brick facade weathered but dignified. The kind of church that had anchored the community for generations. Cars were already filling the parking lot when I arrived, and I recognized many of the vehicles, my relatives' late-model sedans and SUVs, the kinds of cars that announced middle-class respectability without being ostentatious. I sat in my car for a few minutes, watching people file into the church in their funeral clothes, all dark colors and serious expressions. Through the passenger window, I could see Latoya directing traffic at the church entrance like she was managing a corporate event, pointing family members toward the family room where we would gather before the service began. The family room was exactly what I'd expected, a small space adjacent to the sanctuary, decorated with the kind of generic religious artwork and motivational quotes that church committees favor. Folding chairs were arranged in a loose circle, and someone had set up a table with coffee, juice, and the kind of store-bought cookies that appear at every church function. My relatives were clustered in small groups, speaking in the hushed tones that funerals require. I recognized most of them, though some I hadn't seen since the last family funeral 3 years ago. The Carter family had a way of coming together for major events, weddings, funerals, milestone birthdays, maintaining the fiction of closeness through infrequent but ritually important gatherings. "Danielle," Cousin Marcus approached me with his arms open, and his hug felt genuinely warm compared to the carefully measured affection I'd received from others. Marcus had always been different from the rest of the family. More relaxed, less concerned with appearances, easier to be around. "I'm so glad you're here," he said, and I believed him. "She would have wanted you here." "I know," I said, though. I wondered if everyone else knew it too. Latoya appeared beside us, looking polished and professional in a way that suggested she'd been awake for hours preparing for this day. "Danielle, good. We need to go over the processional order. Family will enter first, starting with Mama, and then the rest of us by generation and birth order." "Where should I began, but she was already moving on. "The grandchildren will follow their parents, except for those who are serving as pallbearers. You'll come in after the active pallbearers, but before the honorary pallbearers." I nodded, trying to follow the complex choreography of family hierarchy that had been arranged without my input. It struck me that even the order of our grief had been organized according to some invisible ranking system where I clearly occupied a lower position. Reverend Hill appeared in the doorway, his presence commanding immediate attention. "Family, it's time for the private viewing before we open the sanctuary to the congregation." The family filed toward the door in the order Latoya had specified, and I found myself near the back of the group, walking behind cousins I barely knew, and ahead of family friends who'd been designated as honorary mourners. Through the door, I could see the sanctuary filling with people, but my view was limited to glimpses through the gaps between my relatives' bodies. The casket sat at the front of the sanctuary, surrounded by even more flowers than there had been at the viewing. Someone had arranged the lighting to create a peaceful, dignified atmosphere, and soft organ music played in the background. It was beautiful in the way that funeral services are designed to be beautiful, comforting and reverent, and carefully managed to create the right emotional response. But as we approached the casket for our final family viewing, I felt disconnected from the whole production. This formal, orchestrated goodbye felt nothing like the intimate relationship I'd had with Grandma Evelyn. Where was the woman who'd taught me to make her famous sweet potato pie? Where was the storyteller who'd kept me entertained during long summer afternoons? Where was the fierce defender who'd stood up for me when other family members criticized my choices? Standing there in the back of our family group, looking at her serene face surrounded by flowers that smelled too sweet and overwhelming, I felt like I was saying goodbye to a stranger. "She looks peaceful," someone whispered behind me, "like she's just sleeping," another voice added. But she didn't look like she was sleeping. Not to me. She looked like she was gone, and all that was left was this carefully arranged tableau designed to comfort people who'd never bothered to really see her while she was alive. The private viewing lasted about 15 minutes, with family members taking turns approaching the casket, some weeping quietly, others standing in contemplative silence. I waited my turn, hanging back until most of the others had paid their respects, and then I stepped forward. Up close, I could see the care the funeral home had taken with her appearance. Her hair was styled more formally than she'd ever worn it in life, and her makeup was flawless in a way that seemed to erase the character lines that had mapped the story of her 82 years. She was wearing the navy blue suit someone had selected, but I found myself wishing they'd chosen one of her floral house dresses instead, something that looked more like the woman I'd known and loved. "I'm going to miss you," I whispered too, quietly for anyone else to hear. More than they know. As I stepped back, Reverend Hill approached the podium at the front of the sanctuary. "Family, it's time for the service to begin. Please take your seats according to the arrangements we discussed." This was it. Time to take my place in the back sections. Time to become part of the audience for the official version of Grandma Evelyn's life story. Time to sit quietly and listen to people who'd known her less well than I had, explain who she'd been and what she'd meant. I followed the family processional toward our assigned seats, my heels clicking on the polished wood floor, the sound echoing in the sudden quiet as the sanctuary full of mourners waited for the service to begin. The sanctuary was packed, every pew filled with people who'd come to pay their respects to Evelyn Carter. From my assigned seat in the 4th row, I had a clear view of the backs of my family's heads as they settled into the front pews reserved for immediate family. Latoya sat in the center of the front row beside my mother, their position marking them as the primary mourners, the ones whose grief mattered most in the family's carefully orchestrated hierarchy. I recognized many faces in the crowd. Neighbors, from Grandma Evelyn's street, members of her church committees, people from the community organizations where she'd volunteered over the years. The turnout was impressive, a testament to how well loved she'd been. But I couldn't help feeling like I was observing her funeral, rather than participating in it. The woman sitting next to me introduced herself as Mrs. Campbell from the church's mission committee. "Evelyn was such a blessing to our ministry," she whispered, as we waited for the service to begin. "She never missed a meal packing day, even when her arthritis was acting up. Such dedication." I nodded, grateful for this glimpse of the Grandma Evelyn I knew. The one who showed up, who put other people's needs ahead of her own comfort, who believed that faith meant action, not just prayer. The organ music swelled, signaling the beginning of the service, and conversation died as Reverend Hill took his place at the podium. He was an imposing figure, tall and dignified, with the kind of presence that commanded attention without demanding it. I'd known him peripherally for years, through Grandma Evelyn's stories, but I'd never heard him preach. "We are gathered today not just to mourn the passing of Evelyn Carter," he began, his deep voice carrying easily through the sanctuary, "but to celebrate a life well lived, a woman who understood that faith without works is dead, and who spent 82 years proving that love is a verb, not just a feeling." His opening words surprised me. Most funeral services I'd attended focused on comfort for the living, on the deceased being at peace and in a better place. But Reverend Hill seemed to be preparing to talk about Grandma Evelyn as she'd actually been, a woman of action, not just devotion. He began with her early life, and I found myself learning things about my grandmother that I'd never heard before. How she'd been one of only 3 Black students in her high school graduating class in 1959. How she'd worked 2 jobs to put herself through secretarial school. How she'd met my grandfather at a voter registration drive in 1962. Evelyn understood that citizenship was not a spectator sport, Reverend Hill continued. She believed that if you saw something wrong, you had an obligation to do something about it, and she never shrank from that obligation. I glanced toward the front rows, wondering how my family was receiving this version of Grandma Evelyn's story. From where I sat, I could see Latoya's rigid posture, the way she held her head just slightly tilted as if she was listening to something she hadn't expected to hear. The Reverend talked about her role in the civil rights movement, something I'd only heard mentioned in passing during family conversations, but he spoke about it directly, without euphemism or apology. How she'd participated in sit-ins at downtown Birmingham lunch counters. How she'd been arrested twice for protesting segregated facilities. How she'd organized carpools during the Montgomery bus boycott, driving people to work when the buses were empty in protest. Some people prefer to remember the past as something that happened to other people, Reverend Hill said, his eyes sweeping across the congregation. But Evelyn Carter knew that history is something we make every day, and she chose to make history that her grandchildren could be proud of. His words landed like stones in still water, creating ripples I could feel even from the 4th row. This wasn't the sanitized version of Grandma Evelyn's life I'd expected to hear. This was the woman I'd known. Complicated, principled, unafraid, to take stands that made other people uncomfortable. Mrs. Campbell leaned over to whisper. She never talked much about those days, but we all knew. You could see it in how she carried herself, how she never backed down from what was right. The service continued with hymns that had been Grandma Evelyn's favorites, Precious Lord, and How Great Thou Art, sung by a choir that included several of her neighbors and friends. Between the music and the readings, family members were invited to share memories. My mother spoke first, her voice trembling as she talked about Grandma Evelyn as a mother who'd sacrificed everything for her children's education and opportunities. It was a safe, expected eulogy that focused on family devotion without venturing into more complicated territory. Uncle Jerome followed, sharing stories about his mother's cooking and her insistence on Sunday family dinners that brought everyone together. Again, safe ground. The grandmother as family anchor, the woman who kept traditions alive. When Latoya rose to speak, I felt my stomach tighten. I knew my sister well enough to predict that her eulogy would be polished, appropriate, and carefully crafted to reflect well on our family's respectability. She didn't disappoint. Grandma Evelyn was the heart of our family, Latoya began, her voice strong and clear. She taught us the importance of education, hard work, and always conducting ourselves with dignity. She was proud of our accomplishments and always encouraged us to reach higher, to be better than what people expected. It was a nice speech, well delivered, and completely bloodless. Latoya talked about Grandma Evelyn like she was describing a character in a feel-good movie, rather than a real person with opinions and flaws and a complex inner life. But as she continued, something in her tone shifted. Grandma Evelyn believed in family above everything else. She believed that family meant loyalty, meant supporting each other, meant presenting a united front to the world. She understood that our success reflected on all of us, and that our failures did too. I felt heat rise in my cheeks as I realized that somehow, even in a funeral eulogy, Latoya was managing to deliver a criticism of me. The implication was clear to anyone who knew our family dynamics. Some of us had lived up to Grandma Evelyn's expectations, and others had not. She would want us to remember that we carry the Carter name with us wherever we go, Latoya concluded. And she would want us to make sure that name continues to stand for excellence, integrity, and dignity in everything we do. The applause that followed felt forced to me, but maybe I was being too sensitive. Maybe I was reading criticism into words that were meant to be inspiring. But I caught the glance that Latoya shot in my direction as she returned to her seat, and I knew I hadn't imagined the barb. Reverend Hill returned to the podium for the final portion of the service, and I prepared myself for the standard closing. Prayers for the family, assurance that Grandma Evelyn was at peace, invitation for people to join us at the repast. The formal end to a formal service. But instead of moving toward a conclusion, Reverend Hill reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "Before we close," he said, his voice carrying a weight that made the entire sanctuary, "go quiet. I have something that Evelyn asked me to share with you all." My heart began to beat faster. The family in the front rows shifted in their seats, and I could see Latoya's profile as she turned slightly toward my mother, a question in her posture. "About 3 weeks ago," Reverend Hill continued, "Evelyn called me to her house. She was having one of her good days, alert and clear, and she had something she wanted to discuss. She was worried about her funeral, about what would be said and what wouldn't be said. But more than that, she was worried about her family." The silence in the sanctuary was complete now. Even the babies had stopped fussing, as if they sensed that something important was happening. "She gave me this letter," Reverend Hill said, holding up the folded paper, "with specific instructions about when and how to share it. She was very clear that she wanted everyone to hear it, especially her family." Latoya was turned completely around now, looking back at me with an expression I couldn't read. My mother's shoulders were rigid with tension. Throughout the front rows, I could see my relatives exchanging glances, uncertain about what was coming. "She asked me to wait until after the family eulogies," Reverend Hill said. "She wanted to make sure that everyone had a chance to say what they needed to say first, but she also wanted to make sure that she got to say what she needed to say." He unfolded the paper carefully, and I realized I was holding my breath. "She titled this, 'What I Want You to Remember About Me,'" he said, "and she wanted me to read every word." The air in the sanctuary felt charged, like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks. I could feel my pulse in my temples, could hear the blood rushing in my ears. Whatever was in that letter, whatever Grandma Evelyn had wanted to say, it was about to change everything. Reverend Hill cleared his throat and began to read. "My dear family and friends," Reverend Hill began, his voice carrying the weight of Grandma Evelyn's words. "If Marcus is reading this, then I'm gone, and you're all gathered to say goodbye. I hope you've said nice things about me, but I also hope someone mentioned that I wasn't always nice, because the best parts of my life happened when I was being difficult, instead of polite." A ripple of surprised laughter moved through the sanctuary, and I could see shoulders relaxing throughout the congregation. This sounded like Grandma Evelyn, direct, honest, with the kind of humor that caught people off guard. "I've been thinking a lot about what I want you to remember about me, and I realized that if I left it up to others to tell my story, you might not hear the parts that matter most. So I'm going to tell you myself, one last time. Reverend Hill paused, his eyes scanning the congregation before continuing. First, I want you to know that every hard thing I did in my life was worth it. When I got arrested for sitting at that lunch counter in 1963, my mother was so ashamed she wouldn't speak to me for 3 weeks. When I married James Carter, his family said I was too dark and too political for their respectable son. When I had 5 babies in 7 years and worked 2 jobs to help put James through college, people said I was trying to do too much. The sanctuary was completely silent now. This wasn't the gentle, sanitized version of Grandma Evelyn's life that anyone had expected to hear. But I want you to understand something. Every time someone told me I was doing too much, or being too bold, or asking for too much, I was actually doing exactly what needed to be done. And I don't regret a single moment of it. I felt tears stinging my eyes. This was the grandmother I'd known, the one who'd never apologized for taking up space in the world, who'd taught me by example that being difficult was sometimes necessary. I marched because somebody had to march. I organized because somebody had to organize. I spoke up because somebody had to speak up. And yes, it made some people uncomfortable, including some people in this very family. But comfortable people don't change the world. From where I sat, I could see my mother's rigid posture, the way her hands were clenched in her lap. This wasn't the story she wanted told about her mother-in-law, the version that focused on family devotion rather than political activism. I raised 5 children to believe they could be anything they wanted to be, but I also raised them to believe they had responsibilities to something bigger than themselves. I taught them that success without service is just selfishness dressed up in nice clothes. Reverend Hill's voice grew stronger as he continued reading, as if he was gaining confidence from Grandma Evelyn's words. Some of my children learned that lesson better than others. Some of my grandchildren learned it better than others. But that's not their fault. That's mine. I should have been clearer about what I expected. I should have been more direct about what I valued. My heart was pounding now. Where was this going? What had Grandma Evelyn wanted to say that she hadn't been able to say while she was alive? I want to talk specifically about my grandchildren, because they are the future of this family, and I worry that we're teaching them the wrong lessons about what matters. Latoya had turned completely around in her seat now, her face pale. Other family members were shifting uncomfortably, as if they sensed that whatever came next might not be what they wanted to hear. I have been proud of all my grandchildren, but not always for the reasons their parents think I should be proud. I've been proud when they stood up for what was right, even when it was unpopular. I've been proud when they chose service over status, when they chose principle over profit. The words felt like they were aimed directly at me, and I had to grip the edge of the pew to keep my hands from shaking. I've been disappointed when they chose safety over courage, when they worried more about what people would think than about what was actually right. I've been disappointed when they forgot that our family name was built on the backs of people who refused to be quiet when quiet was easier. Mrs. Campbell reached over and squeezed my hand, as if she could sense how these words were affecting me. I want to be very clear about something, Reverend Hill continued, because I think there has been some confusion in this family about who I was most proud of and why. The sanctuary was so quiet, I could hear my own heartbeat. This was it. Whatever. Grandma Evelyn had wanted to say, whatever she'd been building up to, it was coming now. Success is not measured by the size of your house, or the prestige of your job, or how well you fit into other people's expectations. Success is measured by how much love you put into the world, how much justice you fight for, how much courage you show when courage is needed. I felt like I might be sick, or like I might cry, or like I might stand up and cheer. The emotions were too big and too conflicted for the small space of my chest. By that measure, Reverend Hill read, his voice growing softer, some of you have succeeded beyond my wildest dreams, and some of you have disappointed me more than I ever let on. The words hung in the air like smoke, visible and choking. I could feel the entire sanctuary holding its breath, waiting to see who would be named, who would be claimed, who would be found wanting in Grandma Evelyn's final accounting. Reverend Hill looked up from the letter, his eyes finding mine across the rows of mourners. For a moment, I thought he was going to stop there, that he'd reached the end of what he was comfortable sharing publicly. But then he looked back down at the paper and continued reading. I need to say something specific about my granddaughter, Danielle, because I think this family has misunderstood her value for far too long. My name in the sanctuary sounded impossibly loud, like a shout in a library. Every head turned toward me, and I felt completely exposed, as if Grandma Evelyn's words had stripped away all my carefully constructed defenses. This was it. Whatever she'd wanted to say about me, whatever she'd been unable to say while she was alive, the entire family and half the community was about to hear it. I closed my eyes and waited for the judgment to fall. Danielle has been the heartbeat of this family for years, and most of you haven't even noticed, Reverend Hill continued, his voice carrying Grandma Evelyn's words into every corner of the sanctuary. While others were building their careers and their reputations, she was building something more important, a life of service that would have made her ancestors proud. I felt the blood drain from my face. Around me, I could feel people turning to stare, and I wanted to disappear into the wooden pew beneath me. This wasn't what I'd expected. This wasn't the gentle correction I'd hoped for. This was Grandma Evelyn taking a stand that would reshape how everyone saw me. She chose social work over law school, not because she wasn't smart enough for law school. Lord knows she was smarter than half the lawyers in this city. But because she saw that teenage mothers needed advocates more than rich people needed another attorney. My throat felt tight with unshed tears. She'd understood. After all these years of family disapproval, of subtle criticisms about my choices, Grandma Evelyn had understood exactly why I'd made the decisions I'd made. She comes to see me every few weeks, not because she wants something or needs something, but because she knows that old people get lonely and that loneliness can kill you faster than any disease. She listens to my stories even when she's heard them before. She brings me groceries without making a big show about it. She calls just to check on me. From the front row, I could see Latoya's shoulders shaking. Whether from anger or shame or some combination of both, I couldn't tell. But more than that, she's lived her life according to the values I tried to teach all of my children and grandchildren. She stands up for people who can't stand up for themselves. She speaks truth even when truth is uncomfortable. She chooses justice over comfort, service over success. Reverend Hill paused, taking a sip of water from the glass beside the podium. The silence stretched out, and I could hear people shifting in their seats, the quiet sounds of discomfort and surprise. I need to say this plainly, because I don't think I've been clear enough while I was alive, he continued. Danielle represents everything I hoped this family would become. She is my legacy in the truest sense, not just carrying my blood, but carrying my values into the world. The words hit me like a physical force. I pressed my hands against my mouth to keep from sobbing out loud. Mrs. Campbell had tears streaming down her face, and she squeezed my hand so tightly I could feel her wedding ring pressing into my palm. I know some of you think she's wasted. Her education, that she should have aimed higher, made more money, lived a more impressive life. But I want you to understand something. There is no higher calling than the work she does. There is no more impressive life than one spent in service to others. I could see my mother's profile from where I sat, and her face was stone still, frozen in the expression people wear when they're trying not to show what they're really feeling. When I was young and fighting for civil rights, people told me I was wasting my time, that I should focus on my family and leave the world changing to other people. But I knew then what I know now. The world doesn't change unless people are willing to change it. And Danielle has been changing the world one teenage mother at a time, one family at a time, one life at a time. Reverend Hill looked up from the letter again, his eyes finding mine. There was something in his expression. Pride, maybe, or recognition, as if he was seeing me clearly for the first time. I regret that I never told her this directly. He continued reading. I regret that I let her think she was disappointing me when she was actually fulfilling my deepest hopes for what my grandchildren could become. I regret that I didn't stand up to the family members who criticized her choices, who made her feel like she wasn't good enough. My vision blurred with tears I could no longer hold back. All these years, I'd thought I was the disappointment, the granddaughter who'd failed to live up to expectations. But she'd seen something different. She'd seen what I'd been trying to do, even when I couldn't see it clearly myself. So I want to make something very clear to everyone in this room. Reverend Hill read, his voice growing stronger. If anyone has made Danielle feel like she wasn't valued in this family, they were wrong. If anyone has made her feel like her work wasn't important, they were wrong. If anyone has made her feel like she wasn't measuring up to some standard of success, they were using the wrong measuring stick. The sanctuary was completely silent, except for the sound of people crying. I could hear sniffles throughout the congregation, could see people dabbing at their eyes with tissues. Danielle, if you're hearing this, I want you to know that you have been my greatest pride and my deepest joy. Not because you were perfect. None of my grandchildren are perfect, but because you were brave enough to live according to your convictions, even when it was difficult. I was crying openly now, no longer trying to hide my tears. The woman sitting behind me handed me a tissue, and Mrs. Campbell kept hold of my hand like she was anchoring me to something solid. I want you to stop apologizing for who you are. Stop making yourself smaller to make other people more comfortable. Stop thinking that being kind means being quiet when you see injustice. These words felt like they were meant for me alone, like Grandma Evelyn had reached across death to give me permission to be fully myself. You are exactly who I raised you to be. You are exactly who this family needs you to be, even if they don't realize it yet. You are exactly who this world needs you to be. Reverend Hill paused again, and I could see that his own eyes were wet with tears. I'm leaving you something in my will that the rest of the family doesn't know about yet, he read. Not because I love you more than the others, but because I trust you to use it the way I would want it used. You'll understand what I mean when the time comes. What was she talking about? What had she left me? But before I could process that question fully, Reverend Hill was continuing. To the rest of my family, I want you to think carefully about how you've treated Danielle, and I want you to think about what kind of family you want to be going forward. Do you want to be the kind of family that supports each other's dreams, or the kind that tears each other down? Do you want to be the kind of family that values service and justice, or the kind that only cares about appearances and status? I could feel the shift in the sanctuary, could sense people looking at my family members in the front rows with new eyes. This wasn't just a eulogy anymore, it was a reckoning. Because I'm telling you right now, from beyond the grave, Reverend Hill read with something that sounded almost like humor in his voice. If you keep treating my granddaughter like she's not good enough, you're going to answer to me. And I might be dead, but I'm not gone. Despite everything, I found myself smiling through my tears. That was so perfectly Grandma Evelyn, funny and fierce and protective even in death. But as Reverend Hill reached the end of the letter, I realized that everything was about to change. The family dynamics I'd navigated my entire life, the careful balance of trying to belong while being myself, the quiet acceptance of being seen as less than, all of that was over now. Grandma Evelyn had rewritten the story, and there was no going back. The silence that followed Reverend Hill's final words stretched out like a held breath. He folded the letter carefully and placed it back in his jacket pocket, then looked out over the congregation with the calm expression of someone who had done exactly what he'd been asked to do, regardless of the consequences. "Let us pray," he said simply, and the familiar ritual of closing prayer provided a blessed moment of normalcy in what had become the most extraordinary funeral service I'd ever attended. But even as I bowed my head and listened to Reverend Hill's words about comfort and peace and eternal rest, I could feel the energy in the sanctuary, the shocked silence of people processing what they'd just heard, the way grief had been complicated by revelation. When the prayer ended and people began to file out, nobody seemed to know quite what to do. The usual post-funeral routine, the quiet conversations, the logistics of the repast, the gentle hugs and murmured condolences, all of it felt inadequate after what had just happened. I sat in my pew as people moved around me, unable to trust, my legs to carry me just yet. Mrs. Campbell had released my hand, but remained beside me, a steady presence while my world reorganized itself around Grandma Evelyn's words. "Honey," she said quietly, "that was the most powerful thing I've ever heard at a funeral." I nodded, not trusting my voice yet. Across the sanctuary, I could see my family members gathering in uncertain clusters, their usual post-service coordination disrupted by the weight of what they'd just heard. Latoya stood near the front pew talking to my mother, their heads bent together in urgent conversation. "She was so proud of you," Mrs. Campbell continued. "We all knew it, even if she didn't say it as directly as she should have. Every time you visited her, every time you called, she'd light up. 'My Danielle's coming by,' she'd say. 'My Danielle called to check on me.' Like you were the best part of her week." This made me cry harder, because it confirmed what I'd suspected, but never quite believed, that the love I'd felt from her had been real and reciprocated, even when the rest of the family made me feel like I was reaching for something that wasn't there. People were approaching me now, members of the congregation who'd been moved by Grandma Evelyn's letter. Mrs. Washington from the neighborhood, Mr. Johnson from the church's social justice committee, families I recognized from community, events where Grandma Evelyn had volunteered. "She was right about you," Mrs. Washington said, hugging me tightly. "About your work, about who you are. We see it, even if some folks don't." "You're making a difference," Mr. Johnson added. "Don't let anybody tell you different." Their words felt like balm on wounds I'd been carrying for years. But even as I accepted their condolences and their validation, I was acutely aware of my family members' silence. None of them had approached me yet, and I could feel their discomfort from across the sanctuary. Finally, Marcus made his way over. His face was streaked with tears, and when he hugged me, it felt different from his usual casual affection. Deeper, more intentional. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "We should have seen it. We should have said something." "You don't have to," I began, but he interrupted me. "No, I do have to. She was right about everything. About you, about what you've been doing, about how we've been treating you, and I'm ashamed it took her dying for me to really see it." Before I could respond, Latoya appeared beside us. Her perfectly composed funeral demeanor had cracked, and I could see the raw emotion underneath. Anger, shame, confusion, something that might have been grief for more than just our grandmothers. "Death, we need to talk," she said, her voice tight with control. As a family, after the repast, it wasn't a request, and I found myself nodding even though I wasn't sure I was ready for whatever conversation was coming. The repast at the church fellowship hall was unlike any funeral meal I'd ever attended, the usual atmosphere of subdued. Socializing was replaced by an undercurrent of tension and whispered conversations. People kept glancing at me, then looking away when they realized I'd noticed. The family members who usually commanded attention at these events seemed uncertain about how to position themselves. I stayed close to Mrs. Campbell and the other community members who'd known Grandma Evelyn through her volunteer work. They treated me like I belonged, like I'd always belonged, and their acceptance felt like a revelation. For the first time in years, I wasn't performing respectability or trying to prove my worth. I was simply being received as myself. But I could feel my family watching me, and I knew the real reckoning was still coming. It happened in the church. Parking lot, after most of the guests had left. The core family members, my mother, Latoya, Uncle Jerome, Aunt Beverly, Marcus, and a few of the older cousins, formed a loose circle around me like they were conducting some kind of intervention. "That was quite a scene in there," Uncle Jerome said, his tone carefully neutral. "It wasn't a scene," I replied. "It was Grandma Evelyn's final wishes." "She was sick," Aunt Beverly added quickly. "Near the end, you know how she could get confused. Maybe she didn't really understand what she was saying." The implication that Grandma Evelyn's letter was the product of illness or confusion made anger flare hot in my chest. She wasn't confused. She was clearer in that letter than any of us have been about this family in years. "You can't seriously believe she meant all that," Latoya said, her voice sharp with something that sounded like desperation. "About you being the heartbeat of the family, about us disappointing her. She was just emotional. You know how old people get sentimental." "She meant every word," I said firmly. "And deep down, all of you know it." The silence that followed was heavy with uncomfortable truths. I could see them struggling with the cognitive dissonance of having their family hierarchy challenged so publicly, so definitively. My mother spoke for the first time since we'd gathered. "What happens now?" she asked, and her voice sounded smaller than I'd ever heard it. "Now we go home," I said. "And we decide what kind of family we want to be going forward." "But what about—" Latoya began, then stopped herself. "What about what?" "What? About what she said in the letter? About leaving you something? What did she mean by that?" I realized I'd been so overwhelmed by everything else that I'd barely processed that part of Grandma Evelyn's message. She'd left me something the rest of the family didn't know about, something she trusted me to use the way she would have wanted. "I don't know," I said honestly. "I guess we'll find out when the will is read." But even as I said it, I had a feeling that whatever Grandma Evelyn had left me would be about more than money or property. She'd already given me the most important gift, the knowledge that I'd been seen, valued, and loved exactly as I was. As the family began to disperse, heading to their cars with uncertain goodbyes and promises to talk soon, I stood in the church, parking lot feeling like I was standing in a new world. The same buildings, the same streets, the same Alabama sky. But everything had changed. Grandma Evelyn had kept her promise. She'd made sure they remembered not just who she'd been, but who I was too. 3 weeks after the funeral, I received a call from Mr. Peterson, the lawyer who'd handled Grandma Evelyn's legal affairs for the past 15 years. His voice was professionally neutral, but I caught something underneath. Curiosity, maybe? Or anticipation. "Miss Carter, I need to schedule a meeting with you regarding your grandmother's will. Are you available this Saturday morning?" "Of course," I said, though my stomach immediately knotted with anxiety. "Will the rest of the family be there?" "Some of them, yes. But there are also provisions that pertain specifically to you. I think you'll want to hear those first." The law office was in downtown Birmingham, in one of those renovated historic buildings that tried to balance professional dignity with Southern charm. Mr. Peterson was a slight man with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, the sort of lawyer who'd built his practice on trust and competence rather than flashiness. "Before the family arrives," he said, gesturing for me to take a seat in his office, "your grandmother asked me to give you this privately." He handed me an envelope with my name written in Grandma Evelyn's familiar handwriting. My hands shook as I opened it. "Danielle, if you're reading this, then Marcus has read my letter, and you know how proud I am of you. But there are some things I couldn't say in front of everyone, things that are just between you and me. First, I want you to know that choosing you wasn't about punishment for the others. It was about recognition. You understand what money is. It's a tool for justice, for service, for making the world better. Some people see money as a way to build walls between themselves and the world's problems. You'll see it as a way to tear those walls down. I'm leaving you my house and everything in it, plus the investments your grandfather and I made over the years. Mr. Peterson will explain the details, but it's enough to change your life if you want it to. More importantly, it's enough to change other people's lives too. You'll also find some things in the house that will help you understand more about our family history. Documents, photographs, letters I've saved over the years. The story the family tells about who we are and where we come from isn't complete. You deserve to know the whole truth. But here's what I really want you to understand. This inheritance comes with responsibility. I'm not giving you this money to make your life easier. I'm giving it to you because I trust you to use it the way I would have used it, to fight for justice, to help people who need help, to speak truth even when truth is uncomfortable. Don't let guilt about the family's reaction stop you from accepting this gift. They'll be upset. They'll question my decision. They might even say cruel things about you deserving it. But remember what I told you in my letter. You are exactly who I raised you to be. Use this inheritance to do good in the world. Use it to expand your work with teenage mothers. Use it to fight for the kind of justice your great-great-grandmother would have fought for if she'd had the chance. Use it to make sure the Carter name stands for something meaningful. And Danielle, stop apologizing for taking up space. The world needs you to take up more space, not less. All my love, Grandma Evelyn. I read the letter twice, then looked up at Mr. Peterson, who was watching me with patient understanding. She left me everything? I asked, still trying to process what I'd just read. The house, the bank accounts, the investment portfolio, some family heirlooms. Yes, essentially everything. There are small bequests to other family members, memorial donations to several charities, but the bulk of the estate comes to you. How much? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. Including the house and investments, approximately $1.2 million. The number hit me like a physical blow. I'd known Grandma Evelyn was comfortable, but I'd had no idea she'd accumulated that kind of wealth. My grandfather had been a teacher, and she'd worked as a secretary for most of her career. How had they managed to save so much? They were very careful with money, Mr. Peterson explained, as if reading my thoughts. They bought the house in 1965 when that neighborhood was still affordable, invested consistently in blue-chip stocks, never spent beyond their means. Your grandmother continued to live modestly, even after your grandfather's pension, and Social Security provided more than enough for her needs. I thought about her small house with its outdated appliances and furniture she'd owned for decades, the way she'd clip coupons and shop sales even when she could afford not to. She'd been wealthy and lived like she wasn't, saving every dollar, for something she considered more important than her own comfort. The family is going to be furious, I said quietly. That's their problem to solve, Mr. Peterson replied. Your grandmother was of sound mind when she made these decisions. She revised her will 6 months ago, and she was very clear about her intentions. Before I could respond, I heard voices in the outer office. The rest of the family had arrived. They filed into the conference room with the careful dignity people maintain when they're expecting good news. Latoya, my mother, Uncle, Jerome, Aunt Beverly, and several of the cousins. I watched their faces as Mr. Peterson read through the smaller bequests. $5,000 to each of the other grandchildren, $10,000 to each of her children, donations to the NAACP and Southern Poverty Law Center, money for a scholarship fund at her church. They seemed satisfied with these amounts, nodding approvingly at what they probably assumed were preliminary gifts before the main estate was divided among the children. Then Mr. Peterson read the clause about the house and the bulk of the estate, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. There must be some mistake, Latoya said, her voice tight with disbelief. There's no mistake, Mr. Peterson replied calmly. Mrs. Carter was very specific about these arrangements. She left everything to Danielle? Uncle Jerome's voice rose, dangerously. Everything? The house, the investments, the bank accounts? Yes. Aside from the bequests I just mentioned. The explosion I'd been dreading finally came. "This is ridiculous," Aunt Beverly declared. "Mama was sick at the end. She wasn't thinking clearly." "She never even finished college," Latoya added, as if my education level was relevant to the legal validity of the will. "She works at some community center, making barely above minimum wage. What is she going to do with that kind of money?" "I'm sitting right here," I said quietly, but they were too caught up in their outrage to hear me. "We should contest this," Uncle Jerome said, "on grounds of undue influence or diminished capacity. This isn't what she would have wanted if she'd been in her right mind." "Actually," Mr. Peterson interrupted, Mrs. Carter anticipated that some family members might question her decision. She asked me to prepare a detailed memo documenting her mental state and her reasoning for these bequests. She was evaluated by her physician just 2 weeks before she revised the will, and he certified that she was competent to make these decisions. He handed Latoya a thick folder. She also recorded a video statement explaining her decision. "Would you like to see it?" The room fell silent. The idea of hearing Grandma Evelyn explain herself from beyond the grave seemed to drain the fight out of everyone, at least temporarily. "Yes," my mother said quietly. "I think we need to understand." Mr. Peterson set up a laptop on the conference table, and suddenly there she was. Grandma Evelyn, sitting in her familiar floral armchair, looking directly into the camera with the clear, determined expression I remembered so well. "If you're watching this," she began, "then some of you are upset about my will, and you're looking for a way to change what I've decided. Let me save you some time and money. You can't change it, and you shouldn't try to." Even on the small laptop screen, her presence filled the room. This was the Grandma Evelyn I'd known. Sharp, direct, unapologetic. "I know what some of you are thinking. That Danielle doesn't deserve this inheritance because she didn't follow the path you thought she should follow. That she wasted her education. That she doesn't understand money. That she's not responsible enough for this kind of wealth." Latoya shifted uncomfortably in her chair. It was like Grandma Evelyn was reading her mind. "But here's what you don't understand," she continued. "Danielle is the only one who truly understood what I was trying to teach all of you. Success isn't about how much money you make or how impressive your job title is. Success is about how much good you do in the world." She leaned forward slightly, her eyes intense even through the video. "Danielle chose a career helping teenage mothers because she saw a need and decided to fill it. She visits me regularly not because she wants something from me, but because she understands that love is a verb. She speaks up for justice even when it's uncomfortable because she knows that silence in the face of injustice is complicity." I could feel tears starting again, but I didn't try to stop them. "I'm leaving her my estate because I trust her to use it the way James and I would have wanted it used, to make the world a little more just, a little more fair, a little more kind. Some of you have forgotten that money is a tool for service, not just a way to keep score." The camera seemed to focus on her hands, folded in her lap, the wedding ring she'd never taken off even after Granddaddy died. "To my other children and grandchildren, I want you to know that this decision doesn't mean I love you less. It means I see clearly who has the heart and the wisdom to carry on the values that James and I tried to live by." She looked directly into the camera again. "And to those of you who are angry about this decision, I want you to ask yourselves a question. Are you upset because you think Danielle doesn't deserve this inheritance? Or are you upset because you know she deserves it more than you do?" The video ended, and the silence in the conference room was deafening. Nobody looked at me. Nobody looked at each other. The weight of Grandma Evelyn's final judgment hung over us like a storm cloud. Finally, Latoya spoke, her voice barely above, a whisper. "She really meant it. All of it." "She did," Mr. Peterson confirmed. Mrs. Carter spent months thinking about these decisions. This wasn't impulsive or emotional. It was deliberate and carefully considered. My mother stood up abruptly. "I need some air." She left the room without looking at me. One by one, the others followed. until it was just me and Mr. Peterson in the conference room with the laptop still glowing on the table. That was harder than I expected, I admitted. These situations usually are. Money has a way of bringing out both the best and worst in people. What happens now? Now you decide what you want to do with this inheritance. There are no restrictions on it. Mrs. Carter trusted you to make the right choices. But I will say this. In 30 years of practice, I've rarely seen someone think as carefully about their legacy as your grandmother did. I drove to Grandma, Evelyn's house that afternoon, using the keys Mr. Peterson had given me. It felt strange to unlock the door knowing it was my house now, that I had every right to be there even though she was gone. The house was exactly as she'd left it, clean, but lived in, comfortable rather than fancy. The floral armchair where she'd recorded her video message sat in front of the television, an Afghan folded neatly on the arm. Her coffee cup was still in the dish drainer by the kitchen sink. But as I explored more carefully, I began to find the things she'd mentioned in her letter. In her bedroom closet, behind the winter coats, I discovered a file box filled with documents I'd never seen before. Letters from civil rights organizations, newspaper clippings about protests and voter registration drives, photographs of her with people I didn't recognize. One photograph stopped me cold. It showed Grandma Evelyn, maybe 25 years old, standing in front of the Birmingham jail with a sign that read, "Freedom Now." Her expression was fierce and determined, nothing like the gentle grandmother I'd known. This was the activist, the fighter, the woman who'd been willing to go to jail for what she believed in. There were letters, too, correspondence with lawyers and organizers, plans for boycotts and demonstrations, evidence of a life lived with purpose and courage, a life that had been much more politically engaged than the family stories had ever suggested. At the bottom of the box, I found a letter addressed to me, dated just a month before she died. Danielle, if you're reading this, you've inherited more than money. You've inherited a responsibility to continue the work that your great-great-grandmother started, that I continued, that I'm now passing on to you. The women in our family have always been fighters, even when the men preferred us to be quiet. We fought against slavery, against segregation, against poverty, against injustice in all its forms. That's the real Carter family legacy, not the respectability politics some of our relatives prefer. Use this inheritance to expand your work. Start a foundation. Fund programs for teenage mothers. Fight for policy changes that will help the families you serve. Use your voice, and now your resources to make the kind of change that lasts. And remember, you don't owe anyone an apology for being chosen. You don't owe anyone an explanation for being seen as worthy. You are worthy, not because of what you've inherited, but because of who you are and what you do with the gifts you've been given. Make me proud, granddaughter. But more importantly, make yourself proud. All my love. Grandma Evelyn, I sat on her living room floor surrounded by the evidence of her hidden life, understanding finally why she'd chosen me. It wasn't about favoritism or punishment for the others. It was about continuation. She saw in me someone who would carry forward the family's real legacy, not wealth or status, but the courage to fight for justice. My phone buzzed with a text from Latoya. We need to talk about this situation, as a family. But as I looked around, Grandma Evelyn's house, my house now, at the photographs and letters and evidence of a life lived with purpose, I realized that the most important conversation had already happened. Grandma Evelyn had told me exactly what I needed to know. The family would have to find their own way to make peace with her decision. My job was to figure out how to honor the trust she'd placed in me. 6 months later, I sat in the office of the Evelyn Carter Foundation for Young Families, looking out the window at downtown Birmingham. The space was bright and welcoming, with photographs on the walls showing the teenage mothers and their children, who'd been helped by our programs. It was everything I'd dreamed of when I'd worked at the community center, but never thought I'd be able to create. The foundation had been my answer to Grandma Evelyn's challenge. Instead of keeping her house as a shrine to the past, I'd sold it and used the proceeds, along with part of the inheritance, to establish a comprehensive support system for young mothers: childcare, job training, educational support, counseling, and most importantly, advocacy. My phone buzzed with a text from Maya. Saw the article in the Birmingham News about the foundation. Grandma Evelyn would be so proud. The article had run that morning, featuring our 6-month anniversary and the success stories we'd already accumulated. 3 young mothers had earned their GEDs through our program. 2 had started college. 7 had found stable employment. 12 children were in our childcare program while their mothers worked or went to school. But the numbers only told part of the story. What mattered more was the way these young women carried themselves now. With dignity, with hope, with the knowledge that someone believed in their potential. A knock on my office door interrupted my thoughts. "Come in." To my surprise, it was Marcus, holding a newspaper and looking slightly uncomfortable. I hope it's okay that I just stopped by. I was in the neighborhood for a client meeting. Of course. I gestured to the chair across from my desk. "What do you think?" He looked around the office, taking in the family photos on my desk, including one of me and Grandma Evelyn from my college graduation, the certificates of appreciation from community organizations, the children's artwork. That decorated one wall. "It's incredible," he said finally. "What you've built here, what you're doing. It's exactly what she hoped for, isn't it?" I nodded. "I think so. I hope so." "I owe you an apology," Marcus said suddenly. "We all do, but I can only speak for myself. The way we treated you all these years, the way we made you feel like you weren't good enough, it was wrong. And it took Grandma Evelyn dying to make me see it." "You don't have to," I began, but he held up a hand. "Yes, I do, because I've been thinking about what she said in that letter, about the family she wanted us to be versus the family we actually were. And I realized that I want to be better. I want to be the kind of cousin who supports what you're doing instead of questioning whether you're doing enough." His words meant more to me than I'd expected. Of all my family members, Marcus had always been the easiest to be around, but I'd still felt the subtle pressure of his expectations, the sense that I needed to justify my choices to him. "How are the others handling everything?" I asked. Marcus sighed. "About like you'd expect. Mama's still angry, though I think she's more hurt than anything else. She feels like Grandma was criticizing her parenting, like she failed somehow." "That wasn't the point," I said. "Grandma wasn't trying to hurt anyone. She was trying to make sure her values survived her. I know that now. But you know how Mama is. Everything feels personal to her." He paused. "Latoya's been the hardest hit, I think. She's always prided herself on being the successful one, the one who did everything right. Having that questioned so publicly, so definitively, it's shaken her." I felt an unexpected pang of sympathy for my sister. For all her faults, for all the ways she'd made me feel small over the years, I knew that her need for approval and recognition came from the same place as my need for acceptance. We'd both been trying to earn love from a family that sometimes seemed to measure it out in careful portions. "What about you?" I asked Marcus. "Me? I'm proud of you. Proud to be related to you. Proud that our grandmother was wise enough to see what the rest of us missed." He smiled. "And I'm wondering if there's any way I can help with what you're doing here." This surprised me. "Help how?" "I don't know. Legal work, fundraising, whatever you need. I've been thinking about what Grandma said about success and service, and I realized that my law practice has been pretty heavy on success and pretty light on service." Before I could respond, my assistant knocked on the door. "Danielle, the reporter from Southern Living is here for your interview." "Right." I'd almost forgotten about the magazine feature on young social entrepreneurs in the South, the kind of recognition that would have seemed impossible just a year ago, when I was working at the community center and feeling like I was invisible to my own family. "Can you give me 5 more minutes?" I asked. After she left, Marcus stood up. "I should let you go, but Danielle, I meant what I said about wanting to help, and I think there are others in the family who are starting to see things differently too." Others? Some of the younger cousins mainly. People who were too intimidated to speak up before but are realizing they admired what you were doing all along. He headed for the door, then turned back. "Oh, and Mom wanted me to tell you something. She said to tell you that Grandma Evelyn would be proud of what you've built here." After he left, I sat alone in my office for a few minutes before the interview, thinking about how much had changed. Not just the practical things, the foundation, the financial security, the recognition, but the deeper shifts. I no longer spent energy trying to justify my worth to people who'd never understood it. I no longer apologized for taking up space. I no longer made myself smaller to make others more comfortable. The reporter turned out to be a young black woman named Jasmine, who reminded me of some of the teenage mothers I worked with. Smart and determined, but still fighting to be taken seriously. "What made you decide to start the foundation?" she asked as we settled in my office. "My grandmother," I said simply. "She taught me that love is a verb, that faith without works is dead, and that if you see something wrong in the world, you have an obligation to do something about it. Tell me about her." So I did. I told her about Grandma Evelyn, the civil rights activist, not just Grandma Evelyn, the sweet church lady. I told her about the boxes of documents I'd found in her house, the photographs of her at protests, the letters from lawyers and organizers. I told her about a woman who'd lived a life of quiet courage, who'd fought for justice even when it was dangerous, who'd passed on her values to a granddaughter who'd almost been overlooked by the rest of the family. "She sounds like an incredible woman," Jasmine said. She was. And she saw potential in people that others missed. That's what we try to do here. See potential, nurture it, give people the support they need to become who they're meant to be. As the interview continued, I found myself thinking about the letter Grandma Evelyn had left me, about her challenge to use my inheritance to make the world more just. The foundation was just the beginning. There were policy fights to be fought, systemic changes to be made, young women who needed advocates in places where their voices couldn't reach. After Jasmine left, I walked through the foundation's offices, checking on the child care center where babies napped in cribs donated by local businesses, stopping by the computer lab where mothers worked on GED assignments while volunteers watched their children, visiting the counseling rooms where women learned to believe in their own strength. This was what Grandma Evelyn had seen in me, what she'd trusted me to create. Not just a career or a cause, but a continuation of the work she'd started as a young woman standing in front of Birmingham jail with a Freedom Now sign. My phone buzzed with another text, this one from an unknown number. "This is Latoya. I saw the article. We should talk. I've been thinking about what Grandma said, and I think maybe I was wrong about some things." I stared at the message for a long moment. Maybe reconciliation was possible. Maybe the family Grandma Evelyn had envisioned, one that supported each other's dreams, that valued service over status, was still within reach. But even if it wasn't, even if some relationships couldn't be repaired, I knew I'd be okay. I had work that mattered, resources to do that work effectively, and most importantly, the knowledge that I was exactly who I was meant to be. That evening, I drove out to the cemetery where Grandma Evelyn was buried. Her headstone was simple, her name, her dates, and the inscription the family had chosen. Beloved mother and grandmother. But I knew the real inscription, the one that mattered, was written in the lives of the young mothers who would have better futures because of the foundation she'd made possible. It was written in the policy changes we would fight for, the systemic injustices we would challenge, The next generation of children who would grow up with more opportunities because someone had believed their mothers were worth investing in. I kept my promise, I said quietly, placing fresh flowers by her headstone. I'm using it all. The money, the voice, the space you gave me permission to take up. I'm fighting for justice the way you taught me to. The evening light was soft and golden, the kind of light that makes everything look like it's been blessed. As I walked back to my car, I felt Grandma Evelyn's presence with me, not as a ghost or a memory, but as a continuing influence, a voice that would always remind me to choose courage over comfort, service over success, love over fear. The work was just beginning, but I was ready for it. I was exactly who she'd raised me to be, and for the first time in my life, that felt like more than enough. It felt like everything.